The desert smelled of hot metal and burned oil long before the first tank ever appeared on the horizon. In the summer of 1942, North Africa was a vast, pale ocean of sand and stone where engines screamed instead of waves, where every gust of wind carried not salt but dust that scratched at eyes and throats. Somewhere out there, beyond the shimmer of heat and mirage, the Afrika Korps waited. Its Panzers lined up like predators in the morning light, turret barrels pointing east toward Egypt and the Suez Canal. Men moved around them in faded field gray, sweating under steel helmets, boots crunching on gravel and crusted sand, their uniforms streaked with oil and dust. They checked tracks, tightened bolts, wiped goggles, and listened to the familiar cough and roar of Maybach engines idling. The tanks were ready. The men were ready. On paper, this army was still the blade that had cut through British defenses again and again. But behind the neat rows of armored beasts, behind the optimism in the morning briefings, there was a quiet, nagging emptiness. In some of the barrels, the fuel gauges were already far closer to zero than anyone wanted to admit. In Tripoli and Benghazi, in narrow harbors crowded with cranes and warehouses, the story of that emptiness began. The Italian clerks at the docks could feel it in their ledgers, the German quartermasters in their maps and tables, the sailors in the smell of fuel and cordite. Days and weeks before Rommel gave any order in the sand, another clock was ticking in the Mediterranean. Tankers groaned away from the piers at Naples, Taranto, Brindisi, their holds filled with dark, volatile lifeblood, petrol for Panzers, diesel for trucks, oil for ships. They slid past breakwaters into blue water that looked calm and innocent, though everyone aboard knew it was watched by periscopes and patrolled by aircraft from a small, stubborn island named Malta. From that rock, British submarines and strike aircraft had turned the central Mediterranean into a killing ground, sinking such a high proportion of Axis shipping in late 1941 that even German liaison officers called the situation catastrophic. For months, staff officers on both sides had stared at graphs instead of maps. British reports boasted of months where 60% of Axis supplies bound for North Africa were sunk. German and Italian reports complained of tonnage figures that never matched what was demanded in Libya. Rommel's Panzer Army Africa needed somewhere around 70 EU tons of supplies a month to truly function as the sharp, mobile weapon he wanted it to be. But what arrived was routinely far less, eaten away by distance, port capacity, and above all enemy action. The irony was bitter. The Italians had entered the war dreaming of a mare nostrum, their own sea, yet by 1942, their merchant fleet and transport capacity had been bled white. 2/3 of the Italian merchant marine would be sunk by war's end, much of it in this very struggle to feed the Afrika Korps. And yet, in that strange first half of 1942, the pendulum briefly swung toward the Axis. After the furious British offensive from Malta in 1941, the island was pounded into submission by Luftwaffe and Regia Aeronautica raids. Its airfields were cratered, its submarines driven out or forced to hide. For a few precious months, the Mediterranean seemed less deadly. Losses on the Italian convoy routes to Libya fell dramatically. One analysis later noted that in early 1942, only a small fraction of Axis supplies were being lost at sea, easing Rommel's logistics just enough. The Desert Fox sensed opportunity. He seized it in his usual way, not by waiting for everything to be in place, but by pushing forward, trusting that fuel and ammunition would somehow catch up. After the Battle of Gazala in May-June 1942 and the sudden fall of Tobruk, German and Italian tankers felt they were riding a wave. The victory had been dramatic. British brigades overrun, South Africans surrounded. The port that had resisted so stubbornly in 1941 now collapsing in a single day. At staff conferences in Benghazi and Derna, Italian naval officers and German logisticians argued over tonnage tables, but even the pessimists had to admit the numbers didn't look hopeless anymore. Convoys with codenames like Esigenza C3 and Beta had reached North Africa. Fuel stocks in depots around Benghazi and Tobruk had climbed just enough to support one more lunge. The British, they said, were reeling. The Eighth Army was in retreat toward Egypt. If Rommel struck quickly, he might reach the Nile before the British regrouped. The sea, they told themselves, would hold a little longer. In Rome, maps on the walls of the naval staff, Supermarina, showed a string of convoy routes like threads drawn across the central Mediterranean, from Naples and Taranto southward to Tripoli, Benghazi, and Tobruk. Each line was annotated with percentages, losses by month, types of cargo, numbers of ships sunk. In meetings thick with tobacco smoke, admirals reassured Mussolini that, thanks to improved escort tactics and air cover, the worst was behind them. It was Malta that was starving now, they argued, not the Afrika Korps. Their reports pointed out that tonnage delivered to Libya had risen in early 1942 compared to the disaster months of late 1941. In Tripoli, a German quartermaster officer ran his finger along the coastal coastal road on a map pinned to a wooden wall. He added up the fuel already in depots, the expected arrivals from the next Italian tanker convoy, and the consumption estimates for tanks, trucks, and staff cars on a dash from Tobruk toward El Alamein. The figures didn't quite balance, even when he assumed maximum capture of British fuel. He wrote a cautious note, warning that operations eastward would depend heavily on convoys arriving as scheduled. That phrase, polite, bureaucratic, would be buried under bolder words about initiative and tempo. In the desert, Rommel had no patience for ledgers. He had always believed that daring created its own solutions, that logistics could be bullied into keeping up with the Panzers. He had, after all, driven the British back across hundreds of kilometers before, relying on captured British petrol and vehicles as much as on German supply ships. On the other side of the sea, Malta refused to die. Civilians queued for food under the wail of sirens, masonry dust coated everything, and yet the island held. By mid-1942, after desperate convoys like Harpoon and later Pedestal, the British had just enough fuel, ammunition, and food on the Rock to keep it in the fight. Operation Pedestal in August, with the battered tanker Ohio limping into Valletta with aviation fuel, would finally restore Malta's offensive power, forcing Italian convoys to take longer, more dangerous routes, and subjecting them again to air and submarine attack. The stage was set for something very specific, a silent duel between Italian tankers and British hunters, a duel that would decide how far Rommel's panzers could really go. When the sun rose over Mersa Matrew's wreckage and the retreating 8th Army dug in along the narrow bottleneck at El Alamein, the Afrika Korps still looked lethal. Dust plumes trailed behind columns of half-tracks and lorries, antennas whipping. Tanks rolled past burned-out British Grants and Valentines, some of them adorned now with German crosses hastily painted over old markings. The men inside the panzers could smell gasoline on their hands and felt the familiar vibration of engines through the soles of their boots. The fuel tanks weren't empty yet, but in their logbooks, the company sergeants started to note something they hadn't seen so clearly before. Fuel ration, movement limited, training drives canceled. Each kilometer east was another kilometer farther from the ports, and every day at sea, another Italian tanker tried to make that distance disappear, and another British submarine tried to make the tanker disappear instead. Aboard one such Italian tanker, the air below decks was thick with fumes and heat. Pipes rattled softly as the ship pitched through the night. The vessel was old, its paint worn, its crew, mostly reservists and merchant sailors, hastily pressed into wartime service. Many of them, in quieter years, had carried olive oil or grain around the Mediterranean. Now the cargo was aviation gasoline and diesel fuel, millions of liters of it sloshing in the dark spaces beneath their feet. On the bridge, an Italian captain with a gray mustache and salt-crusted cap stared into the darkness ahead. Convoy orders instructed strict radio silence. Only signal lamps and pre-arranged zigzag patterns connected him to the other shadows moving in loose formation. Offshore air cover was thin. The Regia Aeronautica had nowhere near enough long-range fighters to defend every convoy. The captain knew the statistics. Too many tankers like his had gone to the bottom in the last year. But he also knew that without him, some German tank out there would not move. Below the surface, in the cold green-black water, a British submarine's hydrophone operator pressed thick rubber headphones tighter against his ears. A faint, rhythmic thump pulsed through the static of the sea. Propellers, multiple sets, probably a convoy. The submarine's captain, a thin man with a tired face lit only by red control room lamps, leaned over the chart table as the bearings were plotted. They were somewhere on one of the known Italian convoy routes to Benghazi, lines the Royal Navy had practically memorized. Malta-based submarines had made these approaches terrifying, responsible for a significant share of Axis shipping losses in the central Mediterranean. The captain gave the order to come to periscope depth, the hull creaking softly as ballast shifted. When he raised the periscope, the eyepiece smelled faintly of salt and grease. His first impression was just darkness. Then, as his eyes adjusted, he saw them, hazy silhouettes against a band of pale starlight. The convoy, escorts, freighters, and there, a tanker, high-sided with a distinctive profile. He watched the tanker for one slow turn of the periscope. The ship's wake glowed faintly with phosphorescence. A cigarette ember winked near the stern. He imagined the fuel in her belly, and by extension, the panzers that fuel would feed. In that moment, the desert, the distant roar of engines and crack of guns in North Africa, felt connected directly to this silent, tense compartment deep beneath the sea. He whispered the words almost to himself: range, bearing, angle on the bow. The torpedoes left their tubes with a mechanical clank and a small shudder that everyone aboard felt through their boots. In the tanker's engine room, a mechanic heard something, an odd thump, and frowned, but the noise of the engines drowned everything. Seconds stretched, every man in the submarine unconsciously holding his breath. Then the sea delivered the answer, a distant, heavy thud, followed by a low, rising rumble. The captain did not see the explosion directly, but the hydrophone operator flinched as the sound crashed through his earpieces. In the convoy, men on deck saw a sheet of flame blossom on the horizon. On the Italian tanker, the blast was a nightmare of noise and light. One moment, a sailor was leaning against a rail, smoking, listening to the steady thrum of the engines and the hiss of the sea along the hull. The next, he was thrown flat, his cigarette vanishing into a sudden gale of superheated air. The deck buckled under him. Alarms shrieked. A column of fire tore up from the shattered midships tanks, turning the night orange. Burning fuel poured into the water, where it spread like a glowing, floating carpet, licking at the sides of other ships. Men ran, some half-blinded, their boots slipping in spilled oil, hands burning as they grabbed at hot metal. Orders were shouted in Italian and German. Some were drowned out by the roar of the inferno. The captain, clinging to the bridge rail, felt the ship list under him as compartments flooded and the explosion's shockwave tore open seams. He watched his own lifeboats melt in the heat before they could even be lowered. Somewhere, far away in the desert, a staff officer's ledger would record a tidy line: tanker sunk, cargo lost. Here, it was screams and the stench of burning fuel. When news of each lost tanker reached Panzerarmee headquarters, it was just a brief signal, a few clipped phrases. But strung together over weeks and months, those signals formed a noose. Ultra-intelligence in British hands, fed by decrypted Italian and German messages, allowed the RAF and Royal Navy to target convoys with increasing precision, contributing to those disastrous spikes in Axis shipping losses later in 1942. At the same time, Italy itself was running dry. In June 1942, the fuel shortage was so severe that newly built capital ships like the battleship Roma were effectively laid up, used as floating anti-aircraft batteries rather than sent to sea, because the Regia Marina received only a fraction of the fuel it needed. Every ship sunk for Rommel meant not only less petrol in Libya, but less fuel in Italy to protect the next convoy. It was a vicious loop. Mussolini's admirals had to choose between fuel for their own battleships or fuel tankers for North Africa. Often, they chose the tankers, escorting them with smaller, less thirsty vessels and land-based aircraft, but that made the convoys more vulnerable. And as Malta clawed its way back into offensive strength, especially after Pedestal, the hunters became bolder again. By October 1942, British records note that no fuel reached North Africa in the crucial first week of that month, and that British air and submarine strikes were denying the Axis roughly half of their supplies and two-thirds of their oil. Rommel's tanks, still impressive on maps, were finding their operational radius shrinking day by day. In the sand near El Alamein, the consequences showed in quiet, mundane ways before they showed in battle. Tank crews who had once casually driven to nearby units for coffee or cigarettes were now told not to move their vehicles unless strictly ordered. Desert patrols grew shorter, reconnaissance was scaled back. Drivers sat on the hulls of their Panzers, smoking, watching the horizon, listening to the wind rasping against metal instead of the comforting hum of engines. Mechanics stripped cannibalized tanks for parts, rolling wheels and sprockets through dust, the smell of grease thick in the hot air. Nearby, fuel drums, stacked under camouflage nets, were carefully counted every morning by quartermasters who felt more like guardians of a dwindling treasure than clerks. Each drum they opened leaked petrol fumes that mixed with the ever-present odor of sweat, dust, and sun-baked rubber. To the frontline soldiers, the strain showed in rumors. Some swore that the British were flying in fuel by the ton, while the Axis had nothing. Others whispered about an Italian convoy turned back at Benghazi, too afraid of British bombers to enter the harbor. The story was not entirely apocryphal, as one Italian fuel convoy, in November 1942, indeed reversed course rather than risk destruction, leaving Rommel's troops in eastern Libya gasping for petrol. The Germans grumbled about Italian cowardice, while Italian infantry, who often lacked vehicles altogether, snapped that fuel shortages did not matter to them. They would march and die either way. In officers' messes, glasses clinked a little less confidently as men discussed not only British tanks and artillery, but the latest convoy losses and the ominous phrases in situation reports: critical shortages, emergency stocks only. Still, arrogance lingered. Rommel had evaded disaster before. After all, had he not broken the British at Gazala even when his own logistics were fragile? In late August, he tried one last time to seize the initiative with an attack at Alam Halfa, hoping to outflank the British positions, but the fuel that his staff had hoped would arrive in time did not. British air and naval pressure on Axis Axis supply routes had intensified again, and burned-out tankers in the Mediterranean meant burned-out tanks in the desert. Rommel's attack faltered as vehicles literally ran dry in the dunes, forcing him to abandon the offensive and dig in. British accounts describe Axis armored units unable to exploit successes because they lacked the petrol to push on, turning what might once have been a sweeping maneuver into a stalled lunge. From the British side, the picture looked different, but no less connected to the sea. At El Alamein, Montgomery insisted on a buildup unlike anything the Eighth Army had enjoyed before. Thousands of tons of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts stockpiled just behind the front. British logistics officers watched Axis convoys as closely as any admiral, reading ultra-decrypts and plotting where to send submarines and aircraft. They understood that if they could choke Rommel's fuel flow, his famed tactical brilliance would be blunted. In London and Cairo, planners studied Italian shipping figures and smiled grimly as graphs showed increasing losses and decreasing successful deliveries. By October 1942, British sources note that less than half of Axis shipments to North Africa were arriving, and that none of the oil tankers dispatched in the weeks before Montgomery's offensive succeeded in getting their cargo through. In a crowded war room, under dim lights, a British officer used a long pointer to highlight a particular set of dates. "Here," he said, tapping late October. 3 tankers and 1 ammunition ship bound for Rommel, Proserpina, Tergestia, Louisiana, Tripolino. All sunk, or their cargo lost to our strikes. Rommel's fuel deficit by the end of this week will be catastrophic." Around the table, other officers nodded. Each loss in the Mediterranean translated into fewer German tanks capable of counterattacking. When the Eighth Army finally moved, the smell in the room was of cigarette smoke and ink. The desert heat and dust were far away. Yet every decision here would be felt by men in turret baskets and trenches. Back in the desert, a German Panzer company commander crouched with his map spread over the hood of a Kubelwagen as the wind tried to tear it away. Grains of sand hissed against the paper, sticking to sweat on his fingers. The fuel allocation for the next operation, whatever it might be, was being explained by a logistics officer whose truck tires were already half buried in loose sand. The figures were sobering. Each tank would receive enough fuel for a limited series of movements. Into position, some maneuver in battle, and if they were lucky, a withdrawal. There would be no wide-ranging sweeps, no deep exploitation. The commander looked over at his Panzers, their paint faded and scratched by months of sandstorms. Men were sitting in the shade of their hulls, their shirts stained, their faces gaunt. He knew that once, months before, the Afrika Korps had symbolized speed and fluidity. Now, the Desert Fox's army was becoming something else, a line of armored bunkers, powerful but increasingly fixed. At night, the desert grew cold, and the smells changed, from burning petrol and hot metal to damp canvas, tobacco, and the faint sweetness of tea brewed in blackened kettles. Under a sky so star-filled it looked almost fragile, German and Italian soldiers lay on blankets or in shallow scrapes, staring upward. Somewhere to the north, significantly closer than anyone liked, British aircraft droned past, heading for ports or supply dumps. Rumors of Malta's recovery circulated here too, that British submarines were again prowling the convoy routes in force, that Spitfires and Beauforts from the island were hunting at dawn and dusk. Some men believed none of it, others believed too much, imagining every flicker on the horizon to be a burning Italian ship. Close to the coast, the wind sometimes carried faint scents that had no business in the desert: tar, salt, and the ghost of distant smoke from attacks on harbors like Tobruk and Benghazi. When the Second Battle of El Alamein began in late October, the ground vibrated with thousands of British shells. The night sky turned white and orange as artillery pounded Axis positions. The noise crashed against eardrums, echoing off low ridges and out across the flat expanses. In dugouts, Axis soldiers clamped hands over their helmets, mouths full of dust, noses stinging from cordite and the smell of disturbed earth. Rommel was temporarily away in Europe recovering from illness, but he returned urgently as the offensive developed, flying back into a situation already defined by lack. British sources later emphasized that Rommel's forces went into this battle with barely a tenth of the fuel required for sustained operations. That deficit wasn't just a number on a chart, it was a feeling in every seized engine and stranded truck. During the battle, German tank crews fought as hard as they ever had. They ambushed advancing British armor, maneuvered between minefields, and counterattacked where they could. But again and again, their officers were forced to call off promising thrusts because the fuel gauges were sinking toward empty. Commanders had to choose between reinforcing one threatened sector with their last fuel reserves or preserving a mobile reserve to counter some later crisis. Neither option was truly good. Sometimes Panzers were left behind, their crews reassigned, because there was simply no petrol to bring them back. British observers would later find lines of German and Italian vehicles abandoned almost intact, tires still good, engines serviceable, but tanks and trucks without fuel were just strange metal monuments regiments scattered across the sand. The end of the battle turned the supply crisis into collapse. As Montgomery's forces finally broke through, Axis units began a retreat westward that rapidly became a race. But a race required fuel, and fuel was exactly what Rommel lacked. In this period, British submarine and air attacks continued to savage the remaining convoys, including several tankers and ammunition ships whose loss further shredded Axis hopes of stabilizing a line closer to Libya. Italian staff reports and later analyses would note that in late 1942, especially October and November, the Axis lost a catastrophic portion of its shipping to North Africa, with entire cargoes of petrol and ammunition ending up on the sea floor. By mid-November, Rommel's army, retreating through eastern Libya, quite literally, ran out of fuel. One Italian convoy carrying precious petrol turned back rather than risk air attack, leaving stocks in forward areas almost non-existent. Some vehicles were destroyed by their own crews after their last fuel ration. Others were left as they were, keys still in ignitions, guns pointed toward an enemy that would capture them days later. German diaries from these weeks mention columns halted in the middle of nowhere, men waiting in the thin shade of their machines, the silence oppressive, engines that had growled and rattled for months now cooled and ticked, metal contracting in the chill night air. The desert, which had always been merciless, now seemed to swallow sound as well as men. In Italian ports, new tankers were increasingly rare. Those that existed had scars, patched hulls, replacement plates welded where torpedoes had struck previous ships. Shipyard workers painted over older names, trying to disguise the vessels from enemy intelligence. But the Allies' code-breaking and reconnaissance were now too good. The Regia Marina, starved of fuel, could barely protect them. Admirals who had once promised that our convoys will get through now stared at graphs that dipped and never rose. Some pointed out bitterly that years before the war they had warned about dependence on imported oil. Yet now, in late 1942, it was far too late. British submarines and aircraft, many operating from the once crippled Malta, held the central Mediterranean in an invisible grip. For the men in the Afrika Korps, the end came not in a single dramatic moment, but in a series of small, humiliating realizations. A driver woke to find that his truck, which had carried water and ammunition forward for months, had been left off the fuel list. He would not be moving that day, or perhaps ever again. A tank commander was told that his company's movement orders had been cancelled, not because the enemy wasn't there to be struck, but because there simply wasn't enough petrol to move the whole unit. Infantrymen marching west in long columns watched German and Italian vehicles roll past them, those lucky enough still to have fuel, and muttered that once again, as always, their boots would do the work. Even Rommel, who had built his legend on speed and surprise, now found himself writing increasingly despairing reports to Berlin and Rome about supplies. He complained that his army was being asked to fight a modern mechanized war with the fuel stocks of a minor colonial garrison. The last act of this story would be written months later in Tunisia, when a trapped, exhausted Axis army surrendered. But by then, the logic of failure had already been set in 1942's convoy war. British accounts, German analyses, and Italian post-war studies all converge on a simple conclusion. The Afrika Korps did not just lose to better tanks or better generals, it lost to numbers written in fuel tonnage, convoy loss percentages, and the hard limits of what a sea could carry under constant attack. Logistics officers, those quiet men with pencils and charts, turned out to be as decisive as any tank ace. The arrogance had lain in believing otherwise, in trusting that Italian tankers would always somehow slip through, that Malta could be bombed into irrelevance, that a desert army could outrun the mathematics of supply. When the desert wind blows today across the old battlefields, there is little to show of the tank duels and artillery barrages, but divers still visit the wrecks of Italian merchants and tankers on the bottom of the Mediterranean, their hulls lying on the sand far beneath the waves, cargoes of rusting drums and twisted pipes still visible in the beam of a flashlight. On the seabed, the outlines of those ships sketch the ghost of a supply line that never fully materialized, a chain of lost links stretching from Italian ports to Libyan harbors. In the end, Rommel's Panzers did not die of superior armor or numbers alone. Many simply died thirsty, their fuel sacrificed to a war offstage, where Italian tankers burned in the night while the desert waited, silent and patient, for engines that would never start again.